Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you join us right now for this online public lecture with Regent College. I'm James Smoker, the registrar here at Regent, and I'm your host for our time together. So I just have a couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker. We're going to have an hour-long lecture that'll take us to about 1 o'clock, and then we're going to take a short break at that point in case you have somewhere to go at 1 or just need to stretch. And then we're going to have a Q&A time with Joel until 1:30. So there'll be a chance to respond and ask questions after a short break. We're recording the lecture, like I said, but we're not recording the Q&A. So that break will give me a chance to a natural stopping point. And so only Joel and I will be in the recording. And like I said, I've muted all participants upon entry, so you can't unmute yourselves now, but I'll let you do that after the lecture. I'd also just ask if you could not use the chat function during the lecture, just so that it doesn't distract anyone with sort of the pop-up notifications. If Joel says something that provokes a thought or a question, I'd ask that you write it down and then add that to the Q&A time afterwards. So I am pleased to introduce Dr. Joel Mayward, who will be speaking to us on Film as Theology, an analysis of Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life. Joel is the Assistant Professor of Christian Ministries, Theology, and the Arts at George Fox University in Oregon. He is also the theology editor of The Other Journal. He is a prolific Rotten Tomatoes approved film critic, having written for RogerEbert.com, Bright Wall, Dark Room, Christianity Today, Christ and Pop Culture, among many others. And his academic work brings these threads of theology and film together. So Joel currently has 2 book projects on the horizon, as far as I know. One is a book version of his dissertation, which looks at the films of Belgian directors Jean-Pierre and Luc Dardenne through the lens of Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutics. And the other book concerns the philosophical theology in the films of Christopher Nolan. So please join me in welcoming Joel.
Wonderful, James. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who's chosen to take your lunch break to be able to spend time with me, though I recognize that there are people all over the globe. So thank you for staying up late or waking up early. Nearly a decade ago, I was actually a youth and young adults pastor living in Fort Langley in BC. And I moved there in order to be a pastor at that church, but also to attend Regent College. And while my time at Regent was shorter than I expected, and that's a longer story for another day, my love for Regent and the city of Vancouver was kindled, and that love is not dissipated. So I'm deeply grateful to be able to share with you all today about my passion for theology and the arts, and specifically my passion for theology and cinema. And so I'm going to now share my screen, and hopefully you'll all be able to see my slides. So bear with me just a second. In his review of American filmmaker Terrence Malick's 2011 magnum opus and my favorite film of all time, The Tree of Life, film critic Roger Ebert described the film as, quote, a form of prayer. It created within me a spiritual awareness and made me more alert to the awe of existence. I believe it stands free from conventional theologies, end quote. Yeah, as the philosopher Gilles Deleuze once asked, how is it that cinema is so adept at stirring up a spiritual life? Does such cinema speak about God? And does God speak through cinema? Can cinema function as a form of theology beyond the limits of conventional systematic approaches? And certainly the seventh art has portrayed tales of our human quest for the divine since its inception over a century ago. As French film critic André Bazin aptly put it, the cinema has always been interested in God. Still, some theologians dismiss the possibility of film's theological contributions beyond depicting religious stories or illustrating doctrinal concepts, arguing a priori that cinema cannot adequately theologize because the medium is not word-based nor intellectual enough to make substantial propositions about the divine. A dismissal which seems to me to be based more in personal taste than in cultivated appreciation of the form. Because of an underlying tenet of constructive theology is an epistemological humility, which seeks for knowledge of God in every corner of experienced reality vis-a-vis how God interacts with and works within our world, then we may view the films of Terrence Malick as a type of cinematic theology. Before turning to filmmaking, Malick had been on an academic path, studying philosophy at Harvard under the mentorship of Stanley Cavell, being awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to undertake a PhD at Oxford under the supervision of Gilbert Ryle on the topic of world in Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein. And Ryle rejected Malick's topic for being, quote, not philosophical enough. He was teaching phenomenology courses at MIT. He published a scholarly English translation of Heidegger's The Essence of Reasons. To philosophical filmmaker. Subsequently, Malick's cinema has been described as both Heideggerian and Kierkegaardian, and film scholars and philosophers alike have lauded his films for their metaphysical magnitude. But more than simply philosophical, Malick has been, basically since The Tree of Life onward, his films have been recognized for their theological dimensions due to prominent Christian allusions, as well as this evocative sense of the transcendent through the captivating images, the powerful music, and the mythopoetic tone. So I want to take this theological inquiry further, and I wish to propose that Malick's cinema is not merely illustrating philosophical or theological concepts, but is actively doing a type of unconventional philosophical theology via the cinematic form. So rather than theology of film, or even film and theology, I want to propose film as theology. And I suggest that Malick's chosen mode of an audiovisual medium rather than systematic propositions should not elicit some sort of preemptive dismissal, a la Ryle's not philosophical enough, but rather considerable attention. Well, there have been numerous approaches to the relationship between film and theology, and religious studies scholars have effectively shown how film viewing can be functioning as a religious ritual. I want to advance a fresh form of film as theology, audiovisual theologizing, what I'm calling theocinematics. So theocinematics is a constructive synthesis of theology, film theory, film philosophy, and film criticism, which considers film as theology in motion, theos and kinema, akin to the film philosophy proposed by scholars like Stephen Mulhall and Robert Sinnerbrink. In theocinematics, film as quasi-subject can express its own theological thought, which invites and involves the spectator to engage in their own theological interpretations in this kind of hermeneutical spiral. And this opens up the possibility of an interconnection between theology and cinema without prescribing a single resolved answer or a method, nor subsuming one field underneath the other. So it's film and theology combined. In my theocinematic approach here, I'm going to draw on the theological aesthetics of David Brown and the phenomenological film theory of André Bazin, as well as some of his French film critic colleagues, in their mutual understanding of sacramentality. That is, how human beings might experience the transcendent divine other in and through immanent cultural forms. And then I'll apply this to Terrence Malick's 2019 film, A Hidden Life. So I'll begin with David Brown. His expansive project arguing for the sacramental, what he calls, quote, the symbolic mediation of the divine in and through the material, end quote, has considered a wide range of cultural artifacts and their revelatory possibilities as a means of divine grace. So for Brown, this mediation is not strictly instrumental or illustrative. Rather, quote, the material symbol says something about God in its own right. And so it is an indispensable element in assessing both the immediate experience and any further significance it can have, end quote. So instead of beginning with theological frameworks and applying them to cultural works in a kind of instrumental rationality, which, quote, values the arts not in their own right, but only insofar as they preach the gospel, end quote. Brown instead argues that the spiritual experience of cultural works has its own intrinsic theological value, and such works must be first heard in their own right before any critical assessment is offered. For Brown, this is due to the triune God's ongoing activity in human history. Quote, if God is truly generous, would we not expect to find him at work everywhere, and in such a way that all human beings could not only respond to him, however implicitly, but also develop insights from which even Christians could learn? Brown thus defines sacrament more broadly than the conventional Christian rituals of Eucharist and baptism. He links the Latin sacramentum, oath of allegiance, to the Greek mysterion, or mystery or secret, which comes in early biblical translations. In Brown's view, the latter term, mysterion, indicates the presence of the divine hidden realities, or any, quote, mysterious and indwelling that anticipates or points to some greater reality, end quote. In this way, Brown's expansive view of sacrament includes nearly everything in human cultural production as potential sites for God's ongoing revelation, including the visual arts, sculpture, literature, poetry, etc. In his latest work on music, The Extravagance of Music, Brown argues for a generous access, a kind of receptivity to God which allows the dismantling of barriers between our world and God's, that avoids God needing to do something over and beyond simply being already available in virtue of the divine, ubiquitous, or universal presence. Indeed, for Brown, music may serve as a form of revelation by effecting a change within the viewer. Moreover, even as he tends to use the language of kind of dialogue in ways that are similar to the film and theology conversation, he resists a utilitarian view of the arts, arguing instead that theology needs to cease to regard the arts as only appropriate when illustrative of truths already known through Scripture. In his essay, Why Theology Needs the Arts, Brown offers 4 philosophical assumptions in contemporary culture, which support theology's importance to art beyond what he calls exemplarism. The appeal to metaphor and symbol in light of the apparent collapse of dualism in Western culture, the appeal to religious experiences in light of the collapse of metaphysical arguments for theism, our contemporary social conditioning and communication through images primarily, where imagination is now more than ever a central part of our interpretation of cultural forms, and the power of such metaphors and images to move beyond the epistemological limitations of systematic or dogmatic approaches for understanding God. So perhaps due to his own proclivities or other areas of expertise, the cinematic form simply has not yet been sufficiently explored in Brown's writings. And likewise, Brown's insights just haven't been adequately employed within the film and theology subfield. In thus applying Brown's view of sacramentality to film, cinema as art can be approached as potentially revelatory, imbued with the presence of the divine, that God may communicate God's self through any and every film, regardless of its ostensible religious content, but particularly through its aesthetic form. And moreover, Brown's sacramentality has surprising parallels in French phenomenological film theory. André Bazin is considered the patron saint of film theory, primarily for his 2-volume collection, What is Cinema, and his co-founding of the pioneering French film criticism magazine, Cahiers du Cinéma. His ongoing influence in film studies is immense, inspiring a plethora of critiques and reaffirmations with each new decade. So art, science, and religion are integrated within Bazin's film theory, and one commentator declares Bazin's film criticism as, quote, a cinetheology, end quote. In his early essay, The Ontology of the Photographic Image, Bazin originally included a single illustration, the 1931 photograph of the Turin Shroud. The shroud correlates to cinematic celluloid, in that an image is seemingly miraculously imprinted onto the mediating film, a visible historical image of the invisible transcendent God, which appeals to our sense of faith as much as our rational belief. The shroud has objectively captured an image from outside of time and space, but the significance of that image demands an ongoing subjective interpretation. And Bazin's inclusion of the photograph discloses his understanding of photography as incarnational, or even Christological. The image, the photographic image, is an absent presence of reality itself, a literal snapshot in time, allowing us to revisit this reality over and over again. And what's more, cinema, which is the moving photographic image, opens up the possibility for what Bazin called objectivity in time, or change mummified. That is the represented, or better, resurrected duration of time and space before us in a discernible way as a cinematic language. A heterodox Roman Catholic who was involved in the existentialist personalism movement, Bazin was strongly influenced by the likes of Henri Bergson, Emmanuel Mounier, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And scholar Jeffrey Krauss claims that Teilhard animates the whole of Bazin. He found Teilhard's cosmic sacramental vision of a new sphere, the eschatological interconnection between nature, humanity, and God, to be a compelling metaphor for the cinematic form's revelatory capacity. Cinema is this spiritual technology for showing us how the world really is. In other words, cinematic spirituality bonds human beings to the world and to one another by revealing the invisible essence of metaphysical being through the photographic reproduction. It allows us to see the world as it really is, opening up our awareness to the invisible qualities therein. And Bazin had two Roman Catholic friends, Amaury Eifre and Henri Agel, and this is a book that they kind of wrote together, Le Cinéma et le Sacre, who also advanced early phenomenological approaches in film theory. Influenced by Bazin, these two film theorists published a great deal on the religious dimensions of cinema and proposed a theological conversion to images for film studies. In their search for what Agel called true cinema, characterized by spiritual realism, the theorists found theological meaning in a wide variety of films. Agel observes in his article Celluloid and Soul that experience of the sacred is due not primarily to religious themes or directorial intent, but to the film form itself. I'm going to leave this quote up here. I'll allow you to read it yourself if you'd like. But the thing I want to focus on here is that the aesthetic value of film itself is what is connoting transcendence. It's not that transcendence is an outside category placed upon film, but that transcendence can emerge in and through film. It's found in what he calls the plastic, dramatic, melodic forms, which transfigure the moving images and create a deeply spiritual sense. So it's blurring the lines between the sacred and the secular in cinematic aesthetics, observing the transcendent within and through the cinematic form. Sarah Cooper, a film scholar at King's College in London, appropriately describes Agel and Eifre's approach as a phenomenology of grace. So Bazin's classical film theory is recognized as being part of the realist tradition, that cinema has the capacity to create an aesthetic representation of recognizable reality. So while celebrating Italian neorealism, Bazin noted that directors give pride of place to the representation of reality at the expense of dramatic structures, leading to a phenomenological realism wherein the underlying meaning of the film and its highly realistic depiction end up coalescing. So this style uses natural non-stage settings, shot on location rather than expressionistic or staged mise-en-scène. Non-professional actors are simply invited to be rather than act or pretend. Pacing uses long uncut takes and deep focus cinematography, as opposed to classic montage, which edits duration. And so in contrast to formalist or expressionistic film theory, realist cinema tends to give back to the cinema a sense of ambiguity of the real by showing the world as it is within the frame. And to be clear, Bazinian realism is not just mimicry or a naive, objective one-to-one correspondence between cinema and reality, but rather the connection of the technical capacity of film to capture an audiovisual event in time and the phenomenological human experience of time and image and space, and even the transcendent. Robert Stamm, a film theorist, observes this about Bazin. According to Bazin, new approaches to editing and mise-en-scène, especially long-take cinematography and depth of field, allowed the filmmaker to respect the spatiotemporal integrity of the pro-filmic world. He goes on to describe how Bazin sees cinema as a sacrament, an altar where a kind of transubstantiation takes place. I think this language, revelation, faith in the image, sacrament, connotes how Bazin's approach blurs the line between film theory and theology. Even if such a revelation is more imminent than transcendent in just showing us the world as is, Bazin's realist view is that the world objectively is and is permeated with God's presence. He would affirm Robert Bresson's claim. The supernatural in film is only the real rendered more precise, real things seen up close. So I want to draw a substantial link between what Bazin is proposing, and Agel and Eifre as well, with Brown's theological aesthetics in their respective sacramental paradigms. All are viewing cultural artifacts, and in particularly this case, film, as possible sites for human experiences of divine encounters in and through the aesthetic forms themselves. To be clear, I'm not looking now to illustrate or dialogue with Brown's particular theological views, nor am I looking at Malick's films to illustrate Bazinian realism. But when applying both of these notions, basically combining Bazinian spiritual realism with Brown's theological aesthetics that says that art forms can say something about God in their own right. We can make a hermeneutical wager that says certain theology or certain cinema theologizes. So with that sacramentality in mind, we can actually fully focus on Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life. My theological film criticism is going to focus on three aesthetic dimensions of A Hidden Life: the film's pacing and its protracted narrative constructed as a passion tale, the epiphanic cinematography and mise en scène, and the editing and montage techniques, particularly the improvisatory roaming pneumatological camera work, and three, the use of lyrical voiceover in the musical score to generate a sense of the sacred through sound. So to be clear, parsing these elements is not to suggest that they should be viewed individually as dissected components merely instrumental to the whole. Indeed, film is more than the sum of its parts. However, this is merely an expendable scaffold for outlining my argument in order to more clearly call attention to cinema's distinctive formal elements and the theological dimensions therein. So once one is able to recognize the elements, one can better appreciate the whole. A Hidden Life centers on the real-life story of Austrian peasant farmer Franz Jägerstätter and his refusal to swear allegiance to Hitler in World War II due to his Roman Catholic faith. Like Malick's The Thin Red Line, the film takes an unconventional and poetic approach for what is ostensibly an epic World War II movie. It was originally entitled Radegund, after the name of the Edenic mountain village in Austria, where Franz and his beloved wife Fanny lived with their 3 young daughters. In the film, they have a peaceful life of farming and faith and family. As Fanny murmurs in the opening voiceover narration, it seemed that no trouble could reach our valley. We lived above the clouds. All this is upended by the growing influence of the Third Reich, and when Franz is conscripted into Hitler's army, his silent dissent leads to his imprisonment for treason. The historical Franz was executed on August 9th, 1943 at the age of 36, and he was later beatified as a martyr by Pope Benedict on October 26, 2007. Franz's life and death was mostly known by the wider world, or mostly unknown to the wider world, until sociologist Gordon Zahn encountered the peasant's story while doing research on German Catholics, and subsequently published In Solitary Witness, The Life and Death of Franz Jägerstätter in 1964. Thomas Merton also included a chapter on Jägerstätter in his book, Faith and Violence. But Malick's script, however, is based mainly on the real-life letters that are written between Franz and Fanny, which were collected and then edited and published by Erna Putz. But while Franz and Fanny's historical lives serve as the foundation for A Hidden Life, Malick structures the film not as a conventional biopic with a view toward historical accuracy, but as a mythopoetic reimagining of the Passion, with Franz in the Christ role and Fanny as a Marian or Magdalene figure. And my focus here is not so much outlining the narrative content of A Hidden Life as its formal style, that is, how it shows Franz and Fanny's story and the resultant theological reflection this engenders. To be sure, I'm not suggesting that formal style can be divorced from content, or that Malick's aesthetics are merely decorous flair. Malick's style is the content. Film philosopher Robert Sinnerbrink says it well. Malick's cinema aims, quote, to resensitize us through a cinematic poesis towards this sheer presencing of things, while at the same time disclosing different, often conflicting aspects of our shared historical worlds, end quote. So one way in which A Hidden Life attunes us to the cinematic or the sheer presencing of the world is through its patient, protracted pacing. The film shares many characteristics of slow or contemplative cinema and its practitioners, like Andrei Tarkovsky, Bela Tarr. It emphasizes time over narrative. In slow cinema, time does not serve storytelling as much as it becomes the story. As Paul Schrader writes, it's experiential, not expositional. In this way, viewing A Hidden Life functions as a spiritual exercise or discipline in and of itself, a consecrated period of contemplation requiring attentive, prayerful focus. At 174 minutes, it's Malick's longest theatrical film, testing the endurance of its audience in its elliptical and unhurried approach. And much of this lengthy runtime is devoted to the couple's internal wrestling with Franz's resolute conviction, primarily explored through meditative voiceovers and laconic scenes which flow after one another in dreamlike vignettes, punctuated by extra diegetic sounds of church bells ringing, and more on that in a moment. Indeed, there is little actual spoken dialogue from the primary characters, and what they do say is often cryptic or muted in the sound design and experienced in media res. We as the audience often enter and exit scenes mid-conversation and must work to discern their context and significance. Where the historical Franz was outspoken in his eccentric religious and political views, August Diehl's portrayal of a hidden life is composed mainly of subtle gestures and glances. He silently watches as the town mayor drunkenly spews xenophobic rants and denounces Franz as a traitor. He listens with a worried expression while the local Catholic priest and bishop try to convince him to swear allegiance to Hitler. They appeal to Romans 13, saying that God doesn't care what you say, only what's in your heart. Say the oath and think what you like. He maintains quiet composure as a tempter or Satan character, Captain Herder, mockingly tries to enervate Franz through half-truths. How do you know what is good or bad? Do you know better than I? Did heaven tell you this? We all have blood on our hands. No one is innocent. Crime and bloodshed is everywhere. He who created this world, he created evil. Franz's appointed defense attorney pushes for a statement recanting his rebellion. Sign and you'll go free. But I am free, Franz replies. Feldman responds with contempt, so why are you here? Franz whispers, I don't know. The Nazi military judge, played by Bruno Ganz, who oversees Franz's trial, is left shaken by his encounter with the peasant, evoking an image of Pilate with Christ. And in all these scenes, Franz is repeatedly asked by those around him to give reasons for his convictions, to use words, but he is for the most part silent. Where conventional Hollywood dramas or Christian faith-based films would give Franz opportunities for stirring Oscar-worthy speeches about how his Christian faith prompts him to defy nationalist fascism, this Franz as Christ figure in A Hidden Life does not open his mouth. He's led like a lamb to the slaughter, silent like a sheep before his shearers. This silence has strong parallels to medieval Corpus Christi pageants and passion plays, such as the York Cycle. Here's how one scholar describes it. At the climax of the narrative, the long and gruel trial sequence, Christ, the Logos, the Word, stands alone before his accusers, virtually silent, beaten, and abused, a visual icon of suffering, end quote. This is exactly how Diehl portrays Franz, this ordinary yet extraordinary Christ figure, whose very silence critiques the surrounding voices attempting to condemn him and the unseen God that he trusts. By taking this ineffable or apophatic approach, Malick presents Franz and thus Christ as a profound or defiant mystery, mysterion, a devout believer who has somehow died to self-preservation and whose life is now hidden in God. In treating Franz as an opaque, subjective individual and leaving his actions undefended and unexplained, Malick situates Franz as the suffering servant of the cinematic via crucis, allowing such eternal mysteries to remain mysteries, while also provoking the audience's imagination into active thought as to ponder Franz's motives and behavior. Do we view him as a stubborn fanatic who abandons his family for a zealous mission? Or do we view him as a faithful paragon of religious and moral integrity in the face of immeasurable opposition? Though Franz's actions are not necessarily salvific, this is not to suggest that they have no earthly or ethical merit. Indeed, a passage from George Eliot's Middlemarch serves as the film's postscript and the source of its title. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. This coda implies that Franz and Fanny's story matters, that it has and will make a difference, not just in transcendent eternity, but within the immanence of lived history as a model of virtuous resistance against evil. One brief scene symbolizes how such cinematically depicted unhistoric acts might be found as contributing to the growing good of our world. Following the trial where he's found guilty and sentenced to be executed, the Nazi soldiers escorting Franz briefly visit a local German shop. And as Franz is ushered back outside, the guard in front of him accidentally bumps an umbrella by the door, knocking it to the ground. Shackled and having just been condemned to death, Franz silently and deliberately kneels, picking up the umbrella, sets it upright, and walks out the door with his captors. And the moment is at once mundane and profound. History will neither remember nor celebrate a restored umbrella. But for El Roy, the God who sees charity done in secret, there is nothing hidden that will not be made known. The scene suggests that our unseen acts of virtue are not ignored, but remembered by the divine pneumatological witness, the hovering camera that represents the Spirit of God. More on this in a moment. Movie film critic Josh Cabrita affirms this, arguing that the Eliot quotation declares, quote, without a hint of ambiguity, that Franz's unacknowledged sacrifice and the unacknowledged sacrifices of all those like him is not only significant in the light of eternity, but also in the world imminent to the act, end quote. That is, the life and death of such faithful witnesses, both cinematic and historical, is in some way a meaningful contribution to the growing good of the world, both in the immediate historical context of the past and through the transportative power of the cinematic medium in the present sociopolitical context of 21st century Western culture. Indeed, as Franz and Fanny's countercultural postures prophetically speak into our present-day moral imaginations as a kind of cinematic political theology denouncing adherence to depraved ideologies, Vox film critic Elisa Wilkinson observes, quote, "A Hidden Life feels as if it could have been written last year, a movie created in a direct critique of our age, in which radical right-wing nationalist sentiment and white supremacy too often cloaks itself in the disguise of Christianity," end quote. Or, as Franz quietly asks the bishop, and us as the audience, if our leaders are not good, if they're evil, what does one do? A Hidden Life devotes as much attention to Fanny's perspective as it does Franz. It's an explicitly Christian love story, one in which romantic love and divine love, eros and agape, are interpenetrating sources of hopeful resilience in the face of unspeakable loss and suffering. A love which always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. For instance, when Fanny and Franz are reunited after his short stint of military training, they can't keep their hands and lips off of each other, their limbs and bodies intertwining in self-giving intimacy against the verdant pastoral background. There's this iconic close-up shot that I used at the beginning of my talk, their interlocking hands framed against the mountains, which serves as a striking emblematic picture of the marriage between heaven and earth, transcendence and immanence. And later in their final face-to-face moments together before Franz's execution, this erotic and agapic love is thwarted by the Nazi guards, who keep the couple separated with a table and prohibit physical contact, imbuing the scene with rich pathos and tragedy as they gaze longingly at their beloved one last time. Fanny's final whispered words to Franz carry conspicuous parallels to Christ in Matthew 28. "I love you. Whatever you do, whatever comes, I am with you. Always do what is right." By presenting their love and their tragic separation with the mythic quality of a cruciform Odysseus and Penelope, Franz and Fanny's romance generates theological questions about the nature of love's fidelity and sustainability in the midst of suffering, not unlike the philosophical reflections on affliction and the love of God, put forth by another religio-political nonconformist, Simone Weil. Indeed, Franz and Fanny suffer precisely out of their love for God and for one another. And the final spoken words in the film, which are voiced by Fanny, echo the eschatological dimensions of love found in Micah 4 and 1 Corinthians 13. "A time will come when we will know what all this is for. There will be no mysteries. We will know why we live. We'll come together. We'll plant orchards and fields. We'll build the land back up. Franz, I'll meet you there in the mountains." I want to show you one of the film's most provocative and theologically charged scenes, an encounter between Franz and an artist who is painting religious images on the walls of the parish church where Franz serves as a sacristan. Credited as Ollendorf the painter, the man shares a remarkable reflection with Franz and us, the audience, on the relationship between art, theology, and ethics. So allow me to show this, and hopefully you'll be able to see and hear it on your screen.
I paint the tombs of the prophets. I help people look up from those pews and dream. They look up and they imagine that if they lived back in Christ's time, they wouldn't have done what the others did. They would have murdered those whom they now adore. I paint all this suffering, but I don't suffer myself. I make a living of it. What we do is just create sympathy. We create admirers. Don't create followers. Christ's life is a demand. We don't want to be reminded of it. So we don't have to see what happens to the truth. Darker time is coming. And men will be more clever. They won't fight the truth. They'll just ignore it. I paint their comfortable Christ with a halo over his head. How can I show what I haven't lived? Someday I might have the courage to venture. Not yet. Someday I'll paint the true Christ.
I view Malick's inclusion of the scene, which plays little obvious significance in the plot and has no overt historical basis, as this self-reflexive meditation on the theological affordance of artwork. Because the paintings are part of the church's architecture, they bear this immersive, liturgical quality. They're not merely static illustrations, but actual environments which engender participatory ways of knowing. How might such heuristic works of art, like cinema, interrogate the aesthetic ethical dichotomy that was perpetuated since Kant, reforming or transforming the audience's moral imagination and praxis by means of beauty? The painter's words serve as a direct challenge to the Western Church's historical complicity in social injustice, such as the Holocaust, due to complacency in political ideology. Malick, as artist, appears to be pondering whether his cinema has created mere admirers who remain unchanged, or if such stimulating cinematic artworks can create genuine followers of the true Christ by reorienting theological imaginations. Through this scene, the audience is theocinematically confronted with the cost of discipleship in a manner reminiscent of fellow World War II martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer's famous quote, "Whenever Christ calls us, his call leads us to death." Are we worshiping the true Christ who suffered unto death, or a modern, comfortable Christ we have created for ourselves, an idol instead of an icon? As we watch the painter alongside Franz, we can hear church bells faintly tolling in the background, a diegetic impossibility as Franz is the bell ringer and the sacristan, and the bell seems to originate from a distance. While all this is happening, the hovering camera slowly focuses on a shimmer of sunlight dancing on the church floor. The same natural light is then seen flickering on Franz's shoulder like a living tongue of fire, resting on the peasant martyr in a symbol of vocational blessing. So I want to now turn our attention to this light-seeking pneumatological cinematography. Over his past several films, Malick's cinematographic and editing techniques have increasingly deconstructed conventional filmmaking, emerging in this distinctive Malickian visual style, this wandering spiritualized camera, at once subjective and ethereal by the use of Steadicam camera work, which captures aesthetically beautiful glimpses of everyday moments and objects. The editing and montage style features frequent cutaway shots to images of nature. An upward shot of sunlight shining through trees is a common Malick motif, Characters are framed in low-angle shots pointing upward, connoting a sense of wonder and of reverence. In using natural sunlight and often shooting at the golden hour just before sunset, the film's images of an agricultural life and the rugged mountainous landscape are awe-inspiring. In an interview, A Hidden Life's production designer, Sebastian Krawinkel, describes Malick's improvisatory process for capturing these extraordinary within the ordinary moments. Here's the quote. Terry would wander off sets with the actors and the director of photography, Jörg Widmer, in order to capture his unspoiled moments. He always called it picking the low-hanging fruit. He always wanted to capture the beauty that is created in an unforeseen moment by chance or by natural light. The actor that is caught in an unexpected moment when he feels unwatched, an animal that's doing something unexpected, or simply the beauty of anything that appears by accident in front of him in the camera. So in another interview, actress Valerie Pachner, who plays Fanny, describes Malick's direction regarding the light. Quote, there was no artificial lighting. So especially when we were shooting inside, he would always say, search the light. A Hidden Life's naturally front-lit interior images, often with dark foregrounds, prompt comparisons to Vermeer and Rembrandt paintings. We see how light overcomes the darkness as the cinematography allows the organic beauty of the pastoral mise-en-scène to shine through. Cinematographer Jörg Widmer, who served as a Steadicam camera operator on all of Malick's films since The New World, utilizes both the panoramic horizontal axis, which suggests immanence, and this upward turned vertical axis, which suggests transcendence, in the camera's movements and framing to generate a sense of the material world imbued with the divine, which recalls Bazan's sacramental view. Beyond the numerous painterly shots of the majestic mountains surrounding St. Radegund, this transcendent immanent visual dynamic is demonstrated during scenes of Franz's imprisonment. Similar to René's mournful documentary about the Holocaust, Night and Fog, there are long sequence shots of the invisible floating camera, slowly moving down prison corridors past seemingly endless rows of prison cells, drawn towards windows and doorways flooded with natural light. The protracted, uncut Steadicam images, combined with Franz's prayerful voiceover narration, which I'll talk about in a moment, generate a mood of reverence, transforming the prison environment into a place of worship. Franz's prison cell mise-en-scène shares the qualities of a monastic cell. Shots of radiant sunlight beaming through prison windows and overhead God's eye view shots of Franz suggest an active yet invisible divine presence. This is a God-haunted world. In alignment with Malick's previous films, A Hidden Life has a pneumatological cinematography. A spiritualized camera appears to be hovering within the diegetic world, a disembodied invisible presence that's wandering or searching, bearing witness to the events in a kind of charitable curiosity. So Malick encouraged his actors to always be moving, with Widmer's camera following closely nearby, reacting to whatever the actors would do. And the use of 12mm and 16mm short lenses on the red Epic Dragon digital cameras allowed Widmer to capture spacious, high-resolution images of the actors and landscapes without having to make significant lighting or focal adjustments. And the results are these beautifully detailed compositions, which appear both intimate and expansive in this ultra-wide 2.35:1 aspect ratio. So quite literally, we are able to see more of the material world than we would with the naked eye. The wide-angle lens tends to give the image a slightly distorted concave effect, where the edges of the frame are curved and elongated, creating an immersive, dreamlike mood for the film's entirety. The center-focused symmetrical curvature of the composition recalls how celestial images in frescoes painted on a rounded church ceiling appear stretched. And we see many of these kind of interiors throughout A Hidden Life juxtaposed with the images of nature. And I have to give credit to Bill Gabiri of this for his, he made this observation in his review in Vulture. In this way, the diegetic world of A Hidden Life is the material real world, but viewed with a subtly spiritualized expressionistic style. The entire natural world is viewed as a cathedral, a place of worship where the divine is available. And using digital cameras instead of film stock, so this is Malick's first all-digital film, allowed for extremely long takes, sometimes 20 to 40 minutes of uncut captured footage. This provided actors and crew immense amounts of freedom to navigate the natural environment. They could improvise, they could experiment, unscripted dialogue, gestures, and camera angles. All this while capturing what Widmer describes as magical moments, these spontaneous epiphanic instances which generate a sense of excess or transcendence. And the visual style strongly correlates, I think, to Bazinian realism, especially Bazin's praise of the long take and the deep focused photography of genre noir as an invisible witness, which both hides and reveals reality. And again, we can recall Bressan's quote earlier about how the supernatural in film is the real rendered more precise. And because everything in the frame can be seen with such radiant clarity, the audience is invited rather than directed to make their own meaningful sense of the images, generating an awareness of both personal interpretive freedom and an ethical responsibility in our response. In this open and exploratory filmmaking mode lies a cinematic equivalent to the theological paradox of God's sovereignty and human free will, as Malick's camera acts as a spiritual viewfinder, which guides but does not coerce us to truly pay attention to the pro-filmic world, in a manner again echoing Simone Weil, that is, active receptivity to God in a posture of patient and self-emptying prayer, or attention. Malick's characteristic approach to editing complements this pneumatological cinematography. The footage was shot in the summer of 2016, but the film was finally released in 2019 at Cannes, where I was able to actually attend and see it when I was there at Cannes that year. The nearly 3 years of post-production allowed for Malick's extensive editing process. It involves compiling massive amounts of digital footage into a coherent and poetic whole. Malick weaves the visual sequences together with music and voiceover into this kind of cinematic tapestry, which is more interested in generating moods than conventional narrative arcs. Scenes of the striking natural scenery, particularly the colossal mountain peaks that surround St. Radegund, they're juxtaposed with more intimate close-ups of pastoral and familial life. And interspersed with these are darker images, things like from Riefenstahler's 1935 Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, and unsettling archival footage of Hitler on holiday, playing with children. This footage is contrasted with Franz playing or dancing with his daughters, and it provokes us to make an interpretive comparison. We also see a scene of Franz at basic training, watching films himself, film reels of Nazi military victories amongst his fellow conscripted soldiers, and where others applaud the images, Franz sits in silence. Such scenes are kind of like the aforementioned painter conversation, these self-reflexive engagements with the possibility of cinema itself. Malick is contrasting cinema's history of propagating ideologies alongside its capacity to subvert such ideologies through the recreation of the hidden lives of unheralded religious martyrs. So in this way, A Hidden Life functions as a cinematic theological ethics. The film shows us both what is and how it should be shown, and how this may cultivate either virtue or vice in the viewer. And there's also what I would call an apophatic rhythm to the editing in A Hidden Life. Where other directors might reveal, Malick often chooses to cut away or hide certain moments, particularly images of violence. He denies us the image. For instance, in the prisons, we see Franz experiencing torture and torment at the hands of prison guards. Malick even employs a rare POV shot from Franz's perspective as the guards beat and drag him through the Tegel prison corridor. But during these scenes, we rarely actually witness physical blows. The film cuts away right at the moments of impact, which produces a jarring psychological effect for the audience and provokes our imaginations into active thought. We have to fill in the spatiotemporal gaps. And similarly, we don't actually witness the execution of Franz, but we see affecting scenes of Franz comforting a distraught fellow prisoner, then a sequence of shots of Franz entering into a black curtain into this factory-like room filled with bizarre individuals, and then another POV shot of the empty guillotine. We are not made privy to Franz's death. It's this limited experience that Malick denies us and leaves us to our imaginations. And it's just one more example. We never actually overtly see or hear Franz tell Fanny about his decision to resist Hitler. Instead, about 1/3 of the way into the film's runtime, we see them together in silence as the editing jumps between various locations around their homestead, culminating with a scene where Fanny tearfully confronts Franz and says, "You're going to do it, aren't you?" Franz again here is silent, and then they weep together while extra diegetic bells toll in the sound mix. This apophatic approach echoes Robert Bresson's view, expressed in his book, Notes on the Cinematograph. Quote, "Hide the ideas, but so that people find them. The most important will be the most hidden, end quote. In this way, the eponymous hidden life is not only the historical Franz Jägerstätter, but also the invisible Deus absconditus, just beyond the frame, suggested but never directly shown. Malick's elliptical but not obscurant editing and vivid imagery generate a cinematic experience which evokes a sense of yearning or seeking within the audience. The film may not be transformative for every spectator, but only for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, those who are open to receiving the secrets of God's kingdom. Last, I want to look at the voiceover and sound. Lyrical voiceover is another signature Malick trait. With Badlands and Days of Heaven, this narration was a bit more conventional, originating from a single character, which offered subjective commentary on plot developments, and sometimes enigmatic poetical introspection. But Malick's voiceover technique has shifted greatly towards this latter dimension with The Thin Red Line. We hear a polyphony of ambiguous voices, which are often unfixed in time and unaffiliated with the on-screen characters and events. This voiceover is not so much descriptive observations of the plot as it is the revelation of a contemplative and complex interiority, engaging with existential and theological yearnings. It's as if the film has recorded the ineffable existential longings of the human subconscious or spirit. With Malick's later films, such polyphonic and poetic voiceover nearly replaces dialogue entirely, with characters often silently wandering through scenes, while the narration provides subjective access to their pensive interior perspectives. This voiceover approach can be characterized as an acousmetre, a concept originating with film sound theorist Michel Chion. A trope unique to cinema, the acousmetre, a French neologism combining acousmatic and être, like to be, involves an enigmatic oscillating relation between images and sound. It's a voice that's neither wholly inside nor outside the image, but it's somehow unmoored from a subjective body, while nevertheless maintaining a link to the subjective character. It's an invisible, all-powerful subject. Where a pure acousmetre is a voice coming from everywhere, which never visually appears in the diegetic world, yet seemingly inhabits the image, has this kind of omniscience and omnipresence akin to a deity. And Chion actually says that the greatest acousmetre is God. Chion specifically describes Malick's voiceover aesthetic in one of his books as paradoxical acousmetre, in that the heard internal voices are affiliated with distinct diegetic characters, yet, quote, are not understood to be in the present of the images we see, but rather float lyrically in time, end quote. In a uniquely cinematic depiction of mind-body dualism and maybe Platonic understanding, these voices are linked to but not confined by bodies and chronology. Their prayerful verbalized articulations give a sense of emerging from and journeying towards a more eternal subjectivity. We thus hear, but do not directly see, Franz and Fanny voice their prayerful questions and laments, as well as narrate the letters shared between them during Franz's imprisonment, much of it directly quoted from the real-life Jägerstätter's letter correspondence. Such voiceover is the narration of their souls. One of the most significant examples of this voiceover is a poignant scene featuring Franz and Fanny praying in tandem. Immediately following the aforementioned umbrella scene, we hear their prayers oscillating back and forth between the two voices in a transcendental extra-diegetic dialogue, spoken in untranslated German, as we view a montage of images showing a weary-looking imprisoned Franz juxtaposed with shots of his home in St. Radegund. And included is this close-up shot of a furry black caterpillar crawling across a handwritten letter from Franz to Fanny and his daughters, signifying impending transition and transformation. Caterpillars become butterflies. Though physically separated by spatial distance, and soon to be existentially separated by the boundary of death, this distinctly cinematic use of dialogical voiceover transcends such limits and spiritually reunites the lovers in this kind of shared acousmetric colloquy of prayer. There may be they're temporally separated, but in their prayers, they remain knit together through Christ. We also periodically hear the sound of church bells tolling throughout the film, such as in the various montage sequences I've noted, or during Franz's brief conversation with the bishop. The bell sound is both diegetic and extra-diegetic at different points in the film, and it exhibits this kind of quasi-acousmetric quality. Though any singular symbolic meaning of the bell sound hidden, I guess. Is it a call to prayer? Is it a memento mori? Is it a blessing? Is it a warning? Is it just kind of all of the above or open to interpretation? It ultimately serves as this auditory formal punctuation, indicating a new chapter in the narrative, as well as a suggestive reminder of the invisible or divine presence in proximity to the characters, kind of maybe perhaps a cinematic vox dei. I've also wondered if this punctuates the film like a passion play, if it actually can follow along as the 14 stations of the cross. Additionally, James Newton Howard's musical score for A Hidden Life suffuses the film with a sense of the sacred. In a commentary, Howard describes Malick's vision of Radegund. Terry wanted Radegund to feel like Shangri-La, a Garden of Eden where no one could touch them, but then the snake invades. The main musical leitmotif running throughout the film features a harmonic oscillation between piano and violin, where the piano provides an underlying murmur, like the trickle of an ever-flowing river, as the violin's overlaying minor key connotes a melancholic sense of hopeful yearning. Elsewhere, Howard describes this musical theme as Malick's desire to create a sound for light, a sound or a tune or a feeling or a motif of hope, a sound for light. In these interviews, one gets a sense of Malick's collaborators struggling to express the inexpressible as they resort to such metaphors. Howard continues, "It was important for this musical theme to have a sense of longing, as through much of the film, Franz and Fanny are apart. Terry often spoke of how love is accompanied by suffering," end quote. This dialectic between love and suffering is also expressed through the use of silentium, the movement from Arvo Pärt's tintinnabuli piece, Tabula Rasa. The term tintinnabulation, stemming from Latin, means bell sounds. So here again is Malick's sonic use of bells for sacred purposes. Silentium occurs during 3 critical transition sequences. The first one, the music plays over and then thus links a montage of short shots. In a woodcutter shed, Fanny tells Franz, "When have our prayers not been answered? For faithful to him, he'll be faithful to us. I believe him. We love him. That's enough." Then a shot of a waterfall, a shot of water trickling down a stream, water wheel turning at a mill. Franz makes bread with the miller seen here, who shares a tearful diatribe about how the whole world is sick. A villager speaks softly with Franz in the barn. Now in a church, Eckinger, the villager, says to Franz, "They ask you to take an oath to the Antichrist." Another shot of Franz standing in a field blanketed with fog. Another shot of the miller screaming, now silent in the sound mix, and Franz looking distressed, and then a sharp cut to black. And throughout that entire sequence, silentium slowly crescendos to a near overwhelming volume, while the diegetic sounds drop out before the music suddenly cuts to silence, and we hear again bells toll. And immediately following this, Franz receives the letter calling him up to serve, signaling the end of the film's first hour, and the beginning of Franz's Via Dolorosa. The second time silentium appears, it crescendos again during this montage sequence of Franz being transferred to Tegel prison by train. We see a rush of images of train travel as Franz's voiceover tells Fanny not to worry. Then the music suddenly drops out when the Tegel prison door locks behind him. And the last time we hear it is when Franz is brought before the Reich military tribunal to be condemned. And it's this brief but very subtle rise in volume of silentium as the prosecutor's voice reading the charges fades out to silence in the sound design with this kind of medium close-up of Franz's face. So Arvo Pärt's wholly minimalist music has been recognized for its spiritual and theological resonance, as well as being a vehicle of solace for those approaching death in palliative care by creating a peaceful yet elegiac sonic environment. The inclusion of silentium at these pivotal moments in A Hidden Life parallels the bright sadness of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where a person must lose their life in order to save it, in this paradoxical tension between suffering and hope, further emphasizing the film's underlying passion structure. We hear additional sacred music throughout the film from Bach, Handel, and Gorecki. And to borrow a term from theologian Cutter Calloway, we can consider A Hidden Life sacramental music as econic, as in echo, like a sonic icon, allowing us towards God's presence. To close, I want to point out one section of André Bazin's essay on Robert Bresson's 1951 film Diary of a Country Priest, because as he's describing it, it's remarkably evocative of A Hidden Life, and Bazin could actually be describing either film. The pattern of the film's unfolding is not that of tragedy in the usual sense, rather in the sense of the medieval Passion Play, or better still, the Way of the Cross, each sequence being a station along that road. The cinema gives us a film in which the only genuine incidents, the only perceptible movements are those of the life of the spirit. Not only that, it also offers us a new dramatic form that is specifically religious, or better still, specifically theological, a phenomenology of salvation and grace. When we consider that all of the above specifically theological aesthetic elements of a hidden life are perceived synchronously through the duration of the nearly 3-hour running time, the result is this immersive baptismal wave of potentially revelatory encounters, which leaves the viewer emotionally affected and spiritually reoriented in their theological imagination. Whether we analyze a single formal component in a particular scene or receive a hidden life as a whole, what affords this paradoxical superabundance is that a hidden life is cinema. It stands free from conventional theologies as it stirs up a hidden spiritual life. Thank you.